Okay, picking it right back where the other one kind of abruptly ended. Um, so the 60s begins with Kennedy's presidency. Kennedy is young, charming. Um, he is got a lot of charisma, loved by the media, and kind of just fits the mood of like what the 60s is going to be about. Especially the fact of his abrupt assassination. It kind of sets off the 60s, as I was saying. The 60s have already been, you know, historically big with um, the Montgomery bus boycotts happening in the late 50s, rise of King as a public figure, and then culminating in the Freedom Ride, the sit-ins by SNCC, forcing segregation to be a much more public issue, especially with the media on top of this story. Um, Again, kind of culminating with King's dream speech in 1963, just a few months before Kennedy's assassination. So, and that kind of again, when we think about the civil rights movement, moralize it tends to be where the the media, most of our recollection goes there. And that's what the earlier part. I mean, it's obviously very violent if you've seen the videos, even all the way up to the Selma March in 1965 that led to the Voting Rights Act. And as mentioned, Civil Rights Act kind of gets pushed through following the Kennedy in the presidency of LBJ Johnson. This is the nonviolent activist element of the civil rights movement. There is the push. Earlier on, Malcolm X is associated with the Nation of Islam and a form of Black nationalism. Um, we have the falling out there. He's still advocating for self-defense, um, but it's way more nuanced because of his own falling out with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad per se. But Malcolm is assassinated in the early 65, same time that King is in Selma. And so that falls not too long after Kennedy's assassination as well. So you already see, like in the first 5 years of the 60s, King is assassinated, Malcolm X is assassinated. You get some really important civil rights legislation passed. And then move to the late part of the 60s. Let's go there. So late 60s is the focus goes on Vietnam because yes, Eisenhower and Kennedy both were advising the French in some ways in the war, and then directly got the United States involved in the war. Now LBJ would have had a much more memorable presidency if without Vietnam. He probably would have been considered the greatest liberal president next to FDR, um, because of, well, one, he had a whopping victory against Barry Goldwater in '64. Goldwater is considered the father of modern day conservatism, him and Reagan. But his war on poverty and the Great Society that he headed up, things like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, PBS. This is like the great liberal, legacy we still have today. And like I said, he would have been remembered for that because it is under his time as president that you get the civil rights legislation passed as well. Um, However, Vietnam basically ruins him. He wins that '64 election only to not even run in '68. Now, the U.S. probably should never gotten into World War, into Vietnam War. The Gulf and Tonkin Resolution actually was a a false move. There was no real attack that the U.S. hadn't even get involved in the first place. Um, And so from 64 to 68, yeah, growing rise in protests against the war. I mean, this corresponds with the whole 60s movement and the countercultural movement that has already been part of this decade. But it pounces on Vietnam, especially when at the beginning of 68, the Tet Offensive happens. And Tet itself was a loss for the Viet Cong. It wasn't like they won a big, military victory, but they won a moral victory, and it illustrated that the war was not over in a heartbeat. That Viet Cong was just going to go away, and so this seems to show that Johnson and the generals are lying about the war, and so they're going. Johnson is not going to run for re-election. So the election of '68 becomes a watershed moment. RFK, Robert Kennedy, runs, as do others, and again, like his brother John, when Kennedy wins the Democratic primary in California, he's assassinated. So again, this is like this legacy of '68. King is also assassinated a few months before Kennedy. Um, so by the time you get to the Democratic nomination for president, for presidential candidate, there is a riot at the DNC in Chicago. So it is kind of a big mess. Richard Nixon, who is a VP of Eisenhower, will win the nomination. He'll win under this idea that he's going to get the country out of Vietnam. But by 71, there's already, with the Pentagon Papers, already assigned that the war was way more orchestrated at the get go for the U.S. to get involved in their policy of containment than previously known. So it's definitely a big mess. And then by 75, under Ford as president, the U.S. will get out of the war. All right. The civil rights movement, you can't just limit it to the movement going down the South trying to challenge and actually defeat Jim Crow segregation. But that kind of gets a ball rolling for other movements that had existed in various ways throughout American history. Things like the women's liberation movement, for example, pushing for um, women's rights, especially like in the workplace. Feminist movement in the U.S. has been very much connected to voting rights for most of its history until the '60s, where with particularly the work of Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, you get more books about, well, not just books, but more push for women rights and things like that in the '60s. And they call this second wave feminism. Um, and then you have what's called third wave feminism, where much more attention to women of color and their particular rights, right? Because think about like Freedom and others, we would call like more middle class white feminism. The pushes for better representation rights in the workplace. Women of color didn't really have the luxury, more or less, to not work. In some ways, they were working. They didn't have any rights that way either. So it's just feminism itself, like everything, is a way more complex issue, and there's obviously more progression in how to understand, especially in the realm of like race and gender. That's kind of where feminism is really taken off from here. Some would say, especially within the civil rights movement, that after the death of King and Malcolm X, there's a more youthful takeover within various activist movements. You get movements like the Black Panther Party, and the Watts riots here, not too far away from where we're all at. Watts riots really kind of signal the civil unrest in the urban North. So it's not just segregation as the problem, but the United States, and it's just the society is a problem, and so there's a shift there. And Black Panther Party is way more radical in its political commitments, and for pushing for self defense. So in that way, they follow more Malcolm X, at least with the rhetoric. Um, Within Mexican Americans and Latinos in general, but more Mexican Americans, honestly, you have the Chicano movement. Um, this is again, it's a very nuanced approach to just kind of put it under this umbrella. But it's probably the most famous aspects of this is the United Farm Worker Movement, led by Huerta and Chavez. Boycotting certain industries. They're following Gandhi, Dr. King, policy of nonviolent activism, marches, boycotts, Chavez in particular doing hunger strikes. And so that puts Latinos on the map to some extent via activism. Funny thing is, the strike itself was begun by Filipino workers, so I think that's something that can't be forgotten um, in the history. So there are Asian American civil rights movements as well, a little bit under the radar, but in general, you'll see this in the '67 immigration shift that happens. Plus, the reparations are going to be paid to Japanese Americans, families of Japanese Americans who were put in those camps during World War II. So that does happen. Uh, you have the Chicano Moratorium, the Brown Berets, kind of the radical wing of the Chicano movements. I mean, there's a lot of different groups that are pushing for better representation in schools. This is the school walkouts that happened in the late '60s, and the Chicano Moratorium was a big march against the Vietnam War by Chicano movements in LA. Famously, the only casualty of that movement was a guy who wasn't really even involved. He's a really famous Mexican American reporter who was, quote unquote, accidentally shot by a police officer. So it's a kind of it definitely has a this kind of hint of mystery over how this one guy got killed because he was someone who was starting to speak out a lot about the injustices. Finally, you have movements like the American Indian Movement, led by Russell Means, um, and you have their push to get better representation for Native Americans, particularly the takeover of the Wounded Knee Reservation in Dakota is important. Probably most famously known for the Oscar moment where Marlon Brando refused to take the Oscar for The Godfather over this incident and just the history of oppression of Native Americans. And finally, the Stonewall Riots becomes probably the most public face of the gay liberation and just generally LGBT history, because actually all those elements involved in around Stonewall. So it's kind of the first public face of that movement. Okay. All right. So we'll pick up things with Nixon next time since we're almost out of time.